Good evening, everyone, or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Dennis Layton. I'm the Dean of the Jindal School of Languages and Literature, and I'm pleased to launch or open an event that is part of our Jindal School of Languages and Literature Distinguished Lecture Series. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Francesca Orsini, who had a long and productive career as a scholar of India and India's literatures and other literatures, recently retired from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. So I think it's really a treat, and you have a lot to look forward to in this talk. My colleague, Dr. Kanupriya Dhingra, is going to give some words of introduction to Dr. Orsini herself. I simply wanted to welcome you and point out that this is part of a series of lectures that will be continuing through this semester to, we hope, the end of May. If you are in contact with us or if you receive emails from us, we're sending out bulletins about that. Also information on the university website about the JSLL Distinguished Lecture Series. So simply pointing out that there's more to come after what will undoubtedly be a wonderful talk this afternoon. Again, welcome Professor Francesca Orsini, and thank you, Kanupriya Dhingra, for taking the event forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome, everybody, to this fascinating lecture that we have all been looking forward to. All of us know Professor Francesca Orsini very well, and she's worked widely on multilingualism very recently, or the internal conflicts between the different registers of Hindi and Urdu, with a certain political urgency. And her work has also delved into let's say commercial publishing of Hindi and Urdu in the 15th century via Print and Pleasure. She's engaged with rethinking of the history of early modern North Indian literature as well from a multilingual perspective, and with a focus on let's say performance and songs and storytelling as well. One of my favorite projects of Professor Orsini has been her work with CSDS, which is titled English, which focuses on contemporary literature and popular culture as well. But all of us know that she lives and engages with different languages, different nations, and so on. And I've had the absolute pleasure of working under her supervision for my PhD thesis very recently. And it gives me so much joy to invite her here for today's lecture. She's titled it World Literature as a Special Issue, Print Culture and Cold War Internationalism in India. We really look forward to listening to you, Professor, and here's to you. Handing it over.
Thank you very much, Kanupriya, and of course delighted to support any former student, particularly somebody who's done so well, and more in the among the attendees. But I should perhaps start by apologizing. I've been giving, as one does, versions of this lecture for a while, because we look forward to talks as ways of getting feedback. So I apologize to those who've listened to something of what I've said. I'm still working, I'm writing on world literature special issue now, so I'm really looking forward to your feedback today. But let me start. Okay, here we go. Okay. So let me start perhaps by saying, why engage, why the topic and why the title. So I've been of course working on Indian literature, particularly Hindi, some Urdu, some Farsi, North Indian literature for all my career. But I started out as a reader of world literature. And I have come to engage in a way, in a more scholarly way, with the debate and the burgeoning field of world literature for reasons that will become clear in a moment. But first of all, I'd like us to think about, how do we encounter world literature? How do you, as a reader, how have you encountered world literature? There's a very lovely book and a great website by Anne Morgan, a writer and called Reading the World, in which she sort of talks about how, as a graduate of English from Cambridge University and somebody who worked in publishing, at one day she sort of looked at her bookshelves and realized that and she considered herself, of course, a very, a well-read reader. Most of the books on the bookshelves were, in fact, in English. She realized how, it had been easy for her to, to get a degree, to, work in publishing, to think of herself as a well-read reader, without really engaging in literatures beyond English. And so in her website, A Year of Reading the World, she undertook a kind of a journey, a literary journey. And we often perhaps think of ourselves or read world literature as part or connected to some kind of journey, exploration. No? Those are metaphors that often come with world literature, beyond the confines of English. And by reading one book from every country, every recognized country in the world. And if you think that this is a kind of simplistic or a kind of, flattening of world literature as a kind of tourist experience, actually both her readings and her reflections on this exploration in this book are really, really, really interesting about, actually how difficult it is, even in the age of Amazon, no? Where we think that we have the kind of, all of world's literature at a, finger click. How actually it is difficult to find and get and read literature's, text and literatures beyond what is immediately visible. So, and if I think back at how I encountered world literature, for me, I couldn't actually find a picture of the particular shack where I bought secondhand books in Milan. But for me, that was how I browsing and being able to buy cheaply books, secondhand books. I know that for Kanopriya, this is where she found, she encountered world literature, and probably many of you too. This is one of her photographs of the Sunday Patri Bazaar in Daryaganj, which, if you have encountered her and talked to her, you will surely have learnt about. This has been her, lifelong obsession, very interesting one. But, I think this is a good sense of, we may have a kind of quite staid sense of world literature as a canon, the great books, anthologies, but how do we actually encounter it physically? And today I want to think about how, I think that for many people in India, particularly many Indian readers in the post-independence decades, you were much more likely to encounter world literature on the pages of magazines rather than, as books, say. And I want to think about, what does that mean? And it become clear why. And also, what, to use a term that has become kind of current in literary studies today, what are the affordances? What does the format of the magazine, and particularly for today's talk, the magazine special issue, afford us and afford readers? Now, the other, as I said, I've come to engage with world literature studies and as a field because of the kind of the way it has grown or renewed itself and come to interpellate people like me and people like you, I think, who not necessarily work on English literature. Because now world literature, whether it's in, academic jobs or publisher series, academic, we're talking here about the world of academia. It's kind of nudging towards, in these sort of decades of, the explosion of global English, this kind of alignment between global English as a kind of, for business, technology, and so on, and sort of Anglophone, literature, the growth of Anglophone literature in more and more parts of the world, and certain models of world literature which like to be systemic, like to be kind of manage world literature as a, as too unwieldy otherwise, the idea that it can't be all of world's literature. So how to define world literature? And within academia, it's it's kind of, as I said, nudged towards becoming world literature or world literatures, but in English, as a recent job at the University of Oxford said. But also this is an email fragment or part of an email that our CUP editor for a series that Debjani Ganguly and I have started editing, called Cambridge Studies in World Literatures and Cultures. I think now it's turned in world literature, but with basically, arguing back against some of our proposals because the material is not available in English, and how, what we think, and particularly, CUP as a global publisher has discontinued monograph series. This is a monograph series that do not have material published primarily in English. And then, the other part of the problem is, again, how do we encounter literature's text not in English? So we see that the academia is sort of pushing forward a view of world literature as available as in English. And if I think, so of course I'm speaking from London, it's different, in India with the Indian Review of Books, or the review pages of magazines. But if you're sitting in London and you read, the Guardian Weekly Review, the London Review of Books, top books to read for books of the year, and 90%, if not more, are going to be books published in English. So one term that have come up, and it's an unwieldy term for the tongue, is invisibilization. So, of course, literature continues to be written in languages other than English, but it's just not visible. It's been made invisible. So if you read the Guardian, if you read the London Review of Books, if you read the New York Review of Books, you would be forgiven to think, like Anne Morgan thought, that all world's thought, all world's creativity, literary creativity, is happening in English. Of course, there are magazines like Asymptote, like Words Without Borders, like many others, which make it their job to keep promoting writing beyond English, but it's a struggle. There's also within the kind of field of world literature, and the kind of books that very helpfully are grappling with, how to do it, what is world literature, what kind of keywords, what kind of key terms do we need for it. Literature in translation and the movement is thought of a movement of books. So whether it's Gisèle Sapiro's, very large project on translation in world literature, which is based on the Index Translationorum of the UNESCO, or Venkat Mani's book, wonderful book on what the different meanings of world literature in German over the last century and a half, and how different book series and different book publishers and different book translations have like the and after all, Germany was one of the first producers of ideas of world literature, with Goethe, with Handbuch der Weltliteratur, already in the from the late 18th, early 19th, and then 20th centuries. But again, it's bibliomigrancy, Venkat Mani's key term, so the migration of books. Whereas, or again, anthologies, it's all about books. Whereas my argument and my contention has been in the current work that I'm doing and in my talk today, is that for other parts of the world, like in fact India or South Asia more generally, I would say, the work of world literature, the work of translation has been carried out more until recently, I would say, perhaps not necessarily now, but until a few decades ago, largely on the pages of magazines. So let me just talk a little bit about magazines and world literature, and how the different ways in which magazines do world literature before focusing on the special issue as a particular way of doing that magazines can, through which magazines can do world literature. So starting already from the 19th century, we have both in Europe and in India, if we think of the Modern Review from the early 20th century and other magazines, you've got the idea of the magazine as a review. These are quite bulky magazines and often rely, and I'm here quoting from Isabel Hoffmeyer's wonderful book on Gandhi's magazines, Gandhi's printing press. She calls it the form of empire. The periodical is a form of, the review of the form of empire par excellence, a cut and paste assemblage of publications from elsewhere. And often, in fact, if you look at these early, this 19th century, early 20th century magazines, they are made of, cut and paste snippets, gleanings, reprinted articles, often undated, not necessarily sourced. Now, she calls it a form of empire, but I think it's quite interesting that already, if we in fact look at the particularly Modern Review as an example, I think periodicals, reviews like the Modern Review sort of use but also go beyond empire. Now, the Modern Review is not primarily a literary magazine, but it also does magazine. It does magazine, as I would say, in the folds. It does world literature, sorry, in the folds of the magazine. And I think it helps us produce some keywords that I will, keep using and try to sort of develop in the course of today. So the idea that, that world literature can be an effect of a magazine, even if the magazine doesn't necessarily set out to be its primary mission. The magazine helps produce visibility, or as I said, invisibilization. It helps produce visibility and familiarity. And for me, these are really the two key terms for magazines and world literature. Other key terms are thick versus thin knowledge. So thick knowledge happens in terms of, it could be translations, so which I also use the term textual presence. So the text, the literature is there. You can actually, read it and savor it and assess it, or through textual absence by just mentions. So you still become aware. There's a certain visibility and recursivity. So if mention is produced more than once, you can become, and I'm sure all of us are familiar with writers that we have never, or books that we've never actually read. So here are some examples from the Modern Review. So you've got articles on modern Italian poetry without any translation. You've got, this kind of indirect familiarity, so that, you get to know about the literature of Japan, but through a kind of a Western author, Lafcadio Hearn. You've got another article about some Russian novelists. So if you were a reader of the Modern Review, even if you didn't actually read the books, because in fact the Modern Review didn't publish many translations, you would still be, pretty fairly acquainted with certainly European literature, and as in fact the Modern Review is like, pushing for, reorientation to and more greater interest in Asia, and particularly East Asia, some East Asian literature as well. And as part of this kind of relay that is typical of magazines in this period, but also, as we will see later, magazines and translations, so often not just articles, but even translations are reprinted and reformatted, recustomized, you could say, to use a contemporary term. So if we think of the first Hindi book on world literature, Vishwa Sahitya by Padmanlal Punalal Bakshi, the editor from 1927, I think, or 28. He was at the time the editor of the most prestigious Hindi magazine, Saraswati. Now, if you read Vishwa Sahitya, first of all, it's made of it draws on the articles that he wrote for Saraswati, but also some of the information, you know, it's kind of dense with information, again, more textual absence than presence. Some of it, in fact, comes directly from gleanings or articles from the Modern Review. Now, again, before I come to the special issue, work on magazines in world literature so far has tended to focus on modernist little magazines. So if you're interested, you know, a great book by Eric Bolson, Little Magazine World Form, you know, where he says basically you can't have modernism without little magazines. Little magazines, and this is the term that comes out of American academia, where it's, you know, it's the alternative, the non-commercial, the highly literary, avant-garde, often avant-garde, modernist, coterie, little non-commercial magazine, as opposed to, you know, the big commercial magazines that, you know, would churn out fiction by, you know, every month, your Harper's Bazaar, and many other magazines that were, you know, became very popular in 19th century North America. Now, my only problem, you could say, with this book and with this work is that it then, although it acknowledges that in fact magazines came and come in many forms and sizes, it reproduces this kind of, you know, idea of the literary magazines as a little magazines, as a non-commercial magazine, as a modernist magazine. Beyond North America. And in fact, Eric Bolson does talk about a Bengali magazine, Porichai, as a post-colonial magazine. But in fact, as I will show today, you know, there are, you know, many other different sizes and formats and entrepreneurial actors behind magazines. And the format of the little magazine does not really, you know, can be misleading and does not really do justice. So in fact, a series of webinars and now a special issue that I'm working on with Patricia Korvalan really seeks to sort of break out a bit this mold of the little magazine for world literature by bringing to the fore other formats and other contexts. So if we think, and this I'm coming slowly towards my topic of today, of magazines of the 1950s and 60s, for example, and 70s, you know, in India, you have actually a wide range of magazines. You know, you have this sort of kind of broadsheet types, you know, illustrated. This is you know, the time of the, you know, the photojournalism, you know, illustrated, colorful magazines, photographs. If you think just, you know, the range of magazines and newspapers that just the Times of India, which of course is a commercial enterprise, runs, is mind-boggling. Several, so Illustrated Weekly, and in Hindi, Dham Yug, Sarika, which I'm going to focus on today, all are, you know, are by no means small magazines. Caravan, Sarita from the Delhi Press. Also the more literary magazines like Kahani, Kalpana, Nai Kahaniya, you know, in these decades, some particularly, I think of magazines like Kahani or Nai Kahaniya, certainly, you know, middle brow, as Akriti Mandwani would call magazines like Sarita, address a kind of ordinary reader. And all of them do world literature, as we will see. Now, if you are at all interested, I would very much, you know, urge you to, you know, look for magazines. You know, Marwari Pustakalaya in Delhi has a great collection. Some, not very many, are available online. I hope more in the future, because again, in the context of India or South Asia, there's been much more work on colonial magazines than on sort of independence, post-independence, post-colonial magazines. And they definitely, in fact, although some work like Saranyazi's, in fact, and Ravikant on film magazine, a very exciting work, or Akriti Mandwani is coming out, but there's much more, as you can see, that can be done. And I love this quote by, you know, musing by Santu Babu, the protagonist of Vinod Kumar Shukla's, about, just the importance of the crucial role of these magazines in the life of, middle class, lower middle class, very, very, very lower middle class, like Santu Babu and his wife. So he talks about magazines and films about being his kind of lifeline in this otherwise, very, very limited financially, spatially life that he leads in this very, very small town. So how, magazines, newspaper ads, offer a kind of, I love this expression, cheap modernity. They allow you to be modern, but cheaply. You can learn about air travel. You can learn about how hostesses look like, how much, a flight to Bombay costs without, having to being able to, in fact, afford any of it. He buys once a magazine. He can't afford it regularly, but he buys it once a month for his wife so that she knows how to sweat, how to knit a sweater or apply makeup. In fact, although she doesn't want her to apply makeup, but it's this kind of, how to be vicarious, how to be modern through this kind of vicarious consumption. And so we know that, the magazines and an archive, you learn a lot from the table of contents, the paratext, the covers, the ads, how different topics are treated differently, like, Pasternak's death, or an American, how different world literature topics are treated differently, Pasternak death, or a African folktale, but also, this wonderful serendipity and juxtaposition. So you can have, Hindi pocketbooks and Nasser and the stars on the same page. Now, my questions today: how do magazines do Indian and world literature, using some of the key terms that I've suggested before: thick and thin, knowledge, visibility and familiarity, textual presence and absence, spatiality, what do they make contemporary or earlier magazine literature visible or not? So and how spatiality correlates with temporality. I'm going to focus today on the special issue, and particularly the special issues of what I call the spectacular special issues of Sarika. What do they create? What do they afford? How do the story, because some of these, and Sarika in particular, are story magazines, how does the story magazine fit the purpose? And today I'm talking about, magazines in, the post-independence decades, which are also the decades of the Cold War. So what is the correlation between political and literary internationalism? Do we see a kind of close correlation? Does literary visibility kind of map onto political affiliation and alliances? Do literary choices map onto political ones? Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of actually quite different possibilities or ways in which magazines do world literature at this point. So these are all magazines coming out in the 50s and 60s. And what do we see? Well, we see, first of all, textual presence or textual absence or indirect presence. So a magazine like Kahani, half of it is translations, which is a short story magazine, as the title says. Actually, though, much more of Indian languages, rather than just one from, typically one from foreign literatures. Or you have what I particularly like, Caravan, a kind of middle-brow magazine, also does world literature, and it does it in two ways. It does it in sort of great novels condensed, which can also be Indian novels, also Hindi novels or Bengali novels. You've got Bankim or Ilachan Joshi, for example, but also, Western classics, typically Western, and then short stories from around the world. And here I use the term random systematicity because, the world slot is covered pretty systematically, but then which particular story is chosen to represent that part of the world seems pretty random. So you can have a German story on Arabia, Lafcadio Hearn on Japan. So, you don't really get to learn about, Japanese or Arabic literature, really. Interestingly, some of probably the more academic, or in fact, the networked magazines like Quest, which is brought out by the Indian Committee for Cultural Freedom, a kind of liberal US affiliated, CIA funded English magazine. Or Yug Chetna, which is a Hindi, more academic magazine. So they usually do world literature indirectly through critical articles, book reviews, letters from, in the case of Quest, and only very occasionally stories and poems. Kalpana, and I'll show it in a moment, a more sort of highbrow literary and art magazine from Hyderabad, very, a wonderful magazine, chooses a particularly interesting way. It's sort of, it kind of translates into Hindi very dense historical introductions to very detailed to, Latin American, Israeli, German, Irish, Chinese literatures from an American magazines. And this is what I'm going to focus on today. The special issues that Kamleshwar, the Nai Kahani short story writer, when he was editor first of Nai Kahaniya, another short story magazine, and Sarika, the Times of India, Hindi short story magazine, sort of brought out. So, yeah, short story magazines, of course, still very much there in Hindi today. Think of Hans, very much kind of mainstream, so occupying this interesting, so they're not coterie, they're not avant-garde, but they are bringing out, the best and really investing in the new generation of Hindi writers at this time. So this is what Kahani does, really. So new talent, best stories from Indian languages, and then often we find that translations of foreign stories in Hindi magazines at this time tend to be from the ustad, the idea that Hindi writers and writers as well as readers need to learn from the ustad of the genre. So a lot of Chekhov, a lot of Gorky, a lot of Maupassant, and so on and so forth. But in fact, although in fact Kahani brought, was quite eclectic in terms of what it published in Hindi and Indian from Indian languages, either Amrit Rai or Bhaira Prasad Gupta, who was one of the editors, Marxist, communist, their foreign stories were, as I say, either the Ustad or really more Eastern Europe, China, Russia than the rest of the world. Although quite interestingly, you could say political affiliation is, leftist internationalism of the time, but then often the writers are kind of from pre-communist times, like Morish, Zoltan Moric, or Ivan Chankar or Ivo Andrić. So politically, Eastern Europe is communist at this time, but the writers are in fact pre-communist. They're broadly realist. Only some of the Chinese stories, again, there's quite a bit of Lu Xun across the board in the 1950s, before 1962. But some of the Chinese stories are more the hardcore communist ones, social realist ones. Interestingly, I think this is the first African story to be published by an African writer to be published in Hindi. Story by Kenyatta, kind of parable from the 1930s, very much clearly framed as a kind of political, in terms of political affiliation. As you can see, much bigger range of Indian writers in Kahani at this time. This is just to give you a more of a sense of what Kalpana does, so it kind of subcontracts, you could say, or just borrows from books abroad, these really dense articles. And again, I'm thinking about what would it mean if you're a Hindi reader of the 50s and you were, these are 10 pages articles with a lot of, huge lot of, names. And of course, there's some kind of visibility, certainly visibility, the sense that, oh, there's a lot of writers here, lot of names. As usually in Hindi, you know, the sort of transliteration and the sort of reproduction of names is not necessarily very, you know, helpful. So, you know, I think it's interesting to perhaps imagine ourselves as readers, and, you know, these are all names and books that you would not otherwise be able to access, you know, so you know they're there, but you can't read them. Now, just a little word on the special issue, of course, has got a kind of a lineage of its own in Indian periodicals. I would say broadly for two purposes. One is the kind of, you know, if you think of still now the special issues of magazines like Desh in Bangla, you know, they are the kind of the mark, the calendrical year, you know, writers are asked, commissioned, and to write special pieces, best pieces, you know, the best available, you know, they're really collectibles. Huh? So if we think of the magazine, and particularly magazines in Hindi, you know, this kind of reading material that then goes into Raddi. So you don't, you know, often magazines are not kept. The special issue is, you know, wants to transcend this impermanence, wants to become collectible. No, this difference between periodical and sthai sahitya, you know, stable literature that you make. So the special issue wants to become a sthai sahitya. Or you have, and particularly if I think of, you know, magazines like Chand in the colonial period, the special issue that wants to, you know, make an intervention, that wants to shock, particularly with Chand. So, you know, and in fact, some of them, interestingly, have been reprinted, photostate reprinted in recent years. So Achut Ank, where you have, you know, again, felt probably very bold at the time, but you have this very kind of awkward cover of, in fact, non-Dalit editor, Arya Samaji editor of the special issue on untouchability, who is, well, not quite eating together with a Dalit at the same table, or the Pansiank that was censored and proscribed and thus become a kind of huge cause célèbre. Magazines like Kahani, but in fact, most magazines of this time would have special issues, you know, very big special issues. You can see here more than 50 stories. Some some foreign writers, but in fact, mostly for Kahani would be Hindi writers, and creating this, again, sense of, you know, where is Hindi literature now, or the best of Hindi literature, and creating familiarity also in the sense that, you know, inviting readers to, you know, well, to see what the writers look like, and even giving their addresses to, you know, write to them. Finally, I'm getting to my particular topic, which is the special issues. And I think of these special issues by when Kamleshwar was editor, first of Nai Kahaniya for a while, and then of, you know, Sarika. So again, not a small, not a little magazine, you know, had behind the kind of the money, so the financial affordance, but also the editorial help of the Times of India, you know, machine behind, kind of synergies with other Hindi magazines of Times of India, like Dhramyug, and so on. So as you can see, and these are only some of them, in fact, there are also special issues on, you know, new Hindi writing, special issues on Dalit writing, special issues on Marathi literature. I think that's pretty much how Marathi Dalit writing became visible to Hindi readers for the first time, mainstream Hindi readers, at least for the first time. As you can see, Kamleshwar made that sort of edits many special issues, no? So it's not just then an annual special event, but it becomes much more of a kind of, you know, regular intervention. Also a way of grouping, so more like an anthologizing, I suppose, no? Coming closer to thematic anthologies. Indian and world literature around particular themes. As you can see, some of them political, certainly African literature, third world literature, Palestinian resistance literature, some not political, love stories, Walsh Laghukata, the courtesan in world literature. So Naikahani, many of you would be familiar with him. So most famous as a kind of short story writer, really, but also a novelist, screenwriter when he goes to Bombay, in fact, to work for Sarika. He started working, he was a kind of, like many of his generations, did not want a proper job, look for, freelance while to earn while, writing. He worked as translator for Kahani, actually worked in very early days of Doordarshan, and then left the job, too much of an office job for him, edited Nai Kahaniyan, which was very much a Pragativadi, so a progressive short story magazine at the time, wanted it to make it the platform for the Nai Kahani. He's very much also written about, theorized the Nai Kahani, and then he went to work for Sarika, I think later than 78, but I'm not quite sure about when he stopped. Now, I'm also interested in sort of, if we think about how a magazine does world literature, I think it's also interesting to see that a magazine like Sarika, and it's not the only one, but Sarika is particularly, clearly Kamleshwar had a particular internationalist interest in international politics. As he says in one of his memoirs, that, news of Algeria or Indonesia, I should have given the quote, were, circulating in our Galian and Mohalle, like local news, everybody was interested in, these are, after all, the decades of Bandung, of non-alignment, of the Cold War, of the big meetings, the Peace Sammelan, the other literary, internationalist meetings, writers' meetings, financed by and supported by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So this is these are very internationalist decades. African decolonization is happening, Algerian War of Independence, and so on and so forth. So what we see is that, before Kamleshwar comes to Sarika, the foreign stories tend to be more Western European, in fact, or European generally. But also you have this kind of, some film, I think, influence. If I think of this Italian, image of Mario Tobino's stories, you've got contemporary Europe, mostly Western or European writing. You've got a more canonical view, again, this Ustad, you're then learning about the story from the Ustad, which again is more, European canonical, you would say. But then you've got, and this when Kamleshwar, before he joined Sarika, he worked for foreign news, for a sort of current affairs magazine called Ingit. Got really interesting articles by Kamleshwar on the Egyptian story today, the Iranian story today, the Indonesian story today, which again created not just visibility, but familiarity, but mapping, giving names, but also making the trajectory of these literatures familiar by kind of echoing really the trajectory of the short story in Hindi. Now, what I want to focus on more in the time that I've left are what I call these spectacular special issues. So, as we've seen, magazines could do, could work recursively by, or giving some visibility to world literature by publishing typically one story per issue. Kamleshwar often chose, as we see, invested in a different way, which I think is really quite unprecedented, and particularly, as I say, for a magazine that was directed at ordinary, general readers, general Hindi readers. And I think particularly if we think of, within Indian sort of language politics, when we think of, Hindi typically as being viewed as more provincial, English as more internationalist. Well, I don't think there was a magazine that did this kind of literary internationalism in English, either in India or elsewhere at the time. Apart from that, perhaps Lotus, but I'll say what the difference with Lotus are in my view at the time. So already when he was editor of Nai Kahaniyan, he brought out a Videshi Kahani Visheshank, where I think compared to the other, range of foreign authors that we see in some of the other magazines, you can see that, you, in a sense, we start with France and you start with an author kind of very, these are not, the most modernist or, the latest. So again, not necessarily although the editorial says this is I'm giving you a bhavnatmak tasveer of today's world. So the framing discourse is very much kind of the magazine, the story as a window into, how the current world and how people are and writers feel and are trying to express the nai paristiti, to use a Nai Kahani key term, the new conditions of the contemporary world. But as you can see, that's the ratio of non-Western writers and stories is much higher than before. And you've got stories from Turkey, from Egypt, from Latin America, Uruguay, from Korea, from Ghana, Argentina, and so on. Then, as in Sarika, as I said, he sort of invests even more in special issues, and I'm going to talk more about, in fact, this special issue in a moment. As you can see, well, maybe before I do that, the third, so the World Short Story issue, again, the Deshantar issue, the International Story issue of 1969, looks in fact very similar to a Third World issue of 1973. So here, it may start or end, in fact, with a modernist and very recent story by the Nouveau Roman writer Alain Robbe-Grillet, a very famous story, in fact, La Plage, and it also has Heinrich Böll. And I think there's one, I think that, yes, an American short story. But as you can see, what is the world? And again, the cover expresses it very much. The world is this sort of southern globe, which is a term, Dakshin Golard, a term that Kamleshwar uses in the introduction, marching, isn't it? So it's a sort of new world, new decolonizing world. The world, these are the voices of that, world literature. These are the voices of world literature and the voices that the magazine will carry. And as you can see, in fact, some of the most famous in both these magazines, some of the most famous writers, and in fact, some of the most famous stories of world literature and post-colonial literature today. I mean, frankly, when I see Mohtar Lubis or Pramodyanand Tagore being published in Sarika in late 60s and 70s, I mean, I didn't hear of Pramodyanand Tagore until it was published, until Benedict Anderson talked about him in Imagined Communities, the Buru Quartet, and he's not been translated into Italian yet. So how could it be translated into, what was the vision and what were the roots that allowed it and made it translated, a wonderful story in M from the Tales of Blora, translated in Sarika for Hindi readers in 1973. Two of the most famous stories by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, then called James Ngugi, one of Garcia Marquez's most famous stories. You can see a lot of Latin American, the famous Latin American and African writers. As well as, interestingly, I think more than literature that is struggling for visibility today, Arabic literature from the Middle East. And here it's not just Egypt, it's Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and so on. Now, I've talked about this is the Cold War, decolonization decades. So Kamleshwar's literary internationalism, you can see how it reflects, this what we call what in the project that I've worked for 5 years until now, we call significant geographies. So not one world, not one single world, one world system, but in fact several crisscrossing significant geographies. And what are they? Well, in some ways they are the geographies of Bandung, of the Cold War, of non-aligned internationalism. There's a lot, of Arabic, Egyptian, particularly Egyptian stories, several stories published in Sarika, as I said, Indonesia, and this third world, global South. And in another talk that I gave on Sarika, you also have a really interesting issue on neighboring countries. So the idea that, you can really use the special issue, it gives you this affordance to crystallize, to focus, to bring into focus different significant geographies. And interesting, of course, there's a sort of geopolitical vision, a political vision, a geopolitical vision. But then interestingly, the stories are not necessarily political. In fact, often they're not at all. So particularly in the neighboring countries issues, there are stories from Pakistan, from the new Bangladesh, Nepal, and so on, Sri Lanka, and so on. But in fact, the stories are very much like Afghanistan, ordinary stories, everyday stories. And the idea, I think, it's not very articulated in the editorial, is that, this is to, in a way to see, the common humanity, to learn about, the people rather than just think of these as, states within a geopolitical frame. Sarika, as I said, Times of India, more, you can see that there's more money and more higher production values. So whereas the Naikahania special issue or story special issues didn't have any paratext on the writers, here you have, different paratexts that help create familiarity. So Anne Morgan, for example, would say, well, actually, I prefer to just encounter the plain text. Of course, I, as a literature teacher, I always prefer to give some introduction and contextualization. You can see how the magazine tries to sort of contextualize and give some kind of orientation to the readers by giving a little maps here of the country and using different, visual forms. So this is in fact an earlier writer, Hayama Yoshiko, Japanese writer. You can have the photograph, or you can have a generic photograph that in a way gives a sense of, okay, this is a Latin American, modern sort of country or society. In fact, the story, Naya Budget, could be a Hindi story because it's about, an office and, the expectations, the high expectation and gossip about what the new budget will bring that never materialize. Interestingly, the Ngugi is very much introduced as Afrika Sahitya ka ek aisa naam jo punarjagran or sangharsh ka pratik hai. So, giving you a clear contextualization of introduction. He's not an Andolankari of the Mau Mau movement, but Afriki Jati ke akrosh ke wahak zarur hain. And Deshbhak Kahani Aaj ki Afriki Kathaon mein anyatam hai. Afriki Janta jis apman bodh se sulag rahi hai, par saath hi jis manviya bodh ko seene mein samete hai, usi ki ek bemisal kriti hai ye kahani. So contextualization, but also giving a sense of some kind of little literary coordinates. This is a story by a Spanish writer called Leopoldo Alas, in fact, an earlier writer, but a kind of Picasso-esque cock. I'm coming to, yeah, sorry, I know I'm getting a bit out of time. I'll just come to the end very quickly. So Kamleshwar's special issue is very much, seems very much, particularly the Third World one, but also the 1961 special issue, very much putting the Third World as the world. And that seems to be what he also, how he conceptualizes it and articulates in his editorials, in a way similar, in fact, to a more, you could say, aligned magazine, aligned with leftist internationalism, Lotus, which was published in Arabic, French, and English from Egypt. And we know because, we tend to be familiar with it because Fez Ahmad Fez was editor when it moved to Beirut in the 1970s. And in fact, some of the stories and even writers are the same as in Sarika. And some of the discourse is the same. The idea that, this 3/4 of the world is now coming to the fore. But Lotus is much more aligned, with communist internationalism than Sarika, which instead, interestingly, with this sort of Naikahani sensibility, and we also may think perhaps the Times of India, location, the idea that, well, yes, it may be about, the world might be divided between West and decolonizing countries, underdeveloped countries, but he ends, these are in fact superficial and two-dimensional matters. And in fact, the third of the third shore, which could be at first identified as the third world, becomes instead the tide of both shores, the Tisra Kinara of João Guimarães Rosa's story, the third bank of the river, which is in fact a kind of a more philosophical and more existential, transcendent story. And so the third bank, the third world writer, then the third world individual is more the individual who's living, mainstream. It's a more kind of, I would say, midway between modernism and realism, in fact. And we can talk more about it today. Right. Just a quick word about sources. Where does Kamleshwar get all these materials? How are these spectacular special issues assembled? Well, interestingly, not directly from one source, but in fact curating a range of the many sources that, print materials that are being brought out from different, some from, this Cold War propaganda, some like Penguin Writing Today to deprovincialize English readers or American readers, Short Story International, which is a kind of short story digest. And it's interesting for me that two of the stories of the 1969 special issue come from, appear in this issue of Short Story International, which is probably a source, which of course is unrelated. I've already talked about this. He then, as I said, Kamleshwar uses this short story, the special issue in the short story special issue in many different ways. Some are really very ambitious historical projects like this one, Vishwa Kahani Ki Khoj, which is a kind of, could be a course in itself. So you're buying your monthly issue and you get a whole survey of the short story around the world, and a very dense article. Interestingly, again, we could think something that in India's scholarship or post-colonial scholarship, we only started doing later in the 80s and 90s. So India in world literature, as I say, a very broad, flexible, interesting. So the idea that this is world literature, but is world literature made interested, is not about necessarily the latest, though the discourse is about the contemporary, but the stories are not necessarily the latest. And it is to make it, as you can see, interestingly, often non-threatening, political, but not aligned. So, as I said, and I'll maybe I'll come to this in the Q&A. So if we think how magazines do world literature beyond the little magazine, beyond just, what the sort of the net, the idea of network or coterie, or, the latest Pascal Casanova's idea of the, Greenwich meridian of world literature. But look at how magazines do and did world literature. I think we need new keywords like textual presence or absence, visibility and invisibilization, familiarity, thick and thin knowledge, the correlation or non-correlation between spatiality and temporality. I think if we saw particularly these magazines, the idea that magazines do world literature on the cheap, it's like cheap world literature, cheap modernity, and the story as a kind of non-threatening, as a democratic. Kamleshwar has a really interesting argument as the story as the universal languages, of which then the different literatures are just lipi. So not scripts of a language, but languages are scripts of the universal language of the short story. We've seen special issues as a kind of, I would say, particular literary activism, giving a very broad, broader literary education than what you would get in, in school or college. The ones that focus on Indian literature, building an Indian literature sort of field or canon, or just building Indian literature and making world literature visible. We've seen that in the 1950s, perhaps more than in the 1960s and 70s, the Cold War is important. It makes a lot of, it just produces a lot of print material, translations, magazines, from which then magazines like Sarika can draw upon. Particularly in the 50s, you have a clear political and literary affiliation. But actually what we've seen with Sarika is that a broader, third world, you could say, third worldist, decolonizing literary interest and political interest leads to the visibility for actually a wide range of stories and writers that are not just of the left, in fact, a broad range of writers from, all across the political spectrum. I'm interested, I'm keen to think of these as, through the idea of the relay rather than the network, again, because networks suggest a single network somehow, and everybody on the same page, and the single literary meridian and single literary time, global simultaneity of literary experience, as Elizabeth Holt has said. Whereas here, I think relay gives more of the sense of the reuse, the remix, this cut and paste, this where then the agencies is really with the curator, the editor is curating particular views of world literature. And as we've seen, so, political affiliation to the world shore, to the third world, could actually come together with a really original articulation of what third means. I haven't talked about the weakling of translations, but I've talked enough, so let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. This was absolutely interesting, and I have so many questions myself, but may I take this opportunity to ask the attendees to raise their hands, just in case they have any questions. I'm sure there are quite a few. But if I may take a moment right now, I mean, there were so many things that I was intrigued by, and we've had these discussions earlier as well. But, especially the kind of, let's say the role of the editor in making these choices when they are thinking about who is it that they want to translate or, bring into focus, especially now that we are talking about these spectacular, issues. And then again, I mean, I was bound to bring about Daryaganj in this, but when I was recently taking these talks and I knew that this lecture was going to happen, I was trying to pay a special attention to what kind of magazines are being recirculated now, or what is available in the secondhand market as well. And I came across, I do have a couple here. So, for example, here was this issue which had Manglesh Dabral here, and I was wondering if this made that a special issue where you bring focus to an author and so on. But generally wondering about what is the role of an editor here in making these choices. And then I'll go on about asking the questions. We have quite a few coming in.
Sure. Well, so about these particular ones, and in particular Kamleshwar, I mean, I think, so again, working with South Asian magazines, perhaps compared to working with other magazines archives, you don't have the actual archive. I mean, Akriti was lucky that the Delhi Press, for example, is very good. I mean, the best I think I've seen in keeping archives, so you can actually go there and have some sense of how what the thinking and even organization, and even payments, all that kind of, all those aspects about, finance and how much were translators paid, how much, writers were paid, things that just we don't know. And it was particularly frustrating for me that Kamleshwar in the 90s, in fact, in a magazine. So I think, the magazine in Hindi has been, and I'm sure in other Indian languages as well, has really been, I think, the primary platform for literary, life, literary, the creation of literary careers and debates, and as you mentioned, even criticism about particular authors. That's how you bring even to get. I mean, that's how you get even sometimes the bare information about authors and their careers, and as well as critical judgments, is in magazine special issues rather than books, which are fewer and far between. But as I say, Kamleshwar published a series of very gossipy, so very interesting memoirs. He has a lot to say about Hindi literary life of the 1950s, and then actually screenwriting and working in Bombay in the 1970s. So if anybody is interested, a really interesting Yadon ke Shirar. But when it comes to editing, Nay Kahaniyan and Sarika, he says nothing. I was so disappointed. I was thinking, how can you edit, bring out such incredible special issues and say nothing about them? So, there's been some work, and in fact, more work on Dharamveer Bharti as editor of Dharam Yug, and that's, kind of landmark, and even Kamleshwar acknowledges that, having such a high literary figure as Dharamveer Bharti coming to edit a mainstream magazine like Dharam Yug was, very, a landmark moment for bringing the Hindi literary world and, you could say mainstream journalism together. But yeah, he's got nothing to say. So, the editorials are often quite short. There's never any acknowledgement of where the stories are from. In Hindi, as we know, there's no, you just don't mention it. The translators' names are mentioned, but in fact, I wasn't able to talk about it, but I find the translations are often the weak link. Some are good, so for example, Dharamveer Bharti translated, that Gimaraish Rosa story, very good translation. Sometimes you have what I call the kind of the generic Shuddh Hindi, if I may share again. I don't know if you can see the bottom one. So James Googie, the Martyr, which is a very famous story. Shri और श्रीमती गार्स्टन की अपने निवास स्थान पर किसी अज्ञात दल द्वारा हत्या के समाचार को लेकर चारों ओर तरह तरह की टीका टिप्पणियां होने लगी। इस घटना का सविस्तार वर्णन सभी समाचार पत्रों के मुख्य पृष्ठों पर छपा और रेडियो पर विशेष रूप से प्रसारित हुआ. I mean, you have the sense that, really there was not, in a way that Shuddh Hindi had become the general Hindi. And so, maybe translators were not paid very much. Maybe they had to do it very quickly, you know, but, you know, you have, you know, there's a kind of, for me, a mismatch between the enormous investment in having all these stories, this incredible range, and then sometimes the translations don't read. So, you know, you think, okay, you've made all this effort, and then you didn't actually make a great effort in the translation itself. But I'll stop here.
So I think Priyanka has a question here. Priyanka, I'm going to allow you to talk here. Yes, would you like to ask your question? Also, hi.
Hello, Kanupriya, and thank you, Francesca, for that wonderful talk. It's fascinating. I have heard parts of it before, but it's always nice to hear more of your research. So my question was more in terms of the cinema booklets and their relationship with the magazines. I was wondering about the format and content of the magazines in relation to the booklets, which are much shorter in length and content, but quite prolific in 1950s and 60s. And they are also possibly replicating in a much truncated format some of the characteristics of the magazines, like thin description, while summarizing the film's plot, assortment of visuals, song lyrics, advertisements. So do the magazines that you are looking at, do they underline a relationship with the cinema booklet and the film magazines, if at all?
Thank you, Priyanka. Well, actually, I mean, the authorities on film, the authority on film magazines of this period is really Ravikant and Sara Niazi for the Urdu one. So, I mean, I only know what they tell me. So I think, you know, if you go back to the Times of India, of course, you know, film magazines are part of their, you know, of that stable of periodicals. And of course, I mean, that's been Ravikant's argument that in this period, you know, we think of this as the period where, you know, Urdu is, you know, being neglected and sort of unsupported and so on. And actually a magazine like Shama is the widest read. And, you know, again, I would say a great example of magazine activism. So not just, okay, printing whatever comes to you, but really building a magazine as a kind of hub, a hub for readers, but also for the industry, for, you know, these particular magazines that I've been looking, so I think, you know, other magazines are doing that work of engaging with films much more, you know, directly than these ones. In fact, I would say that, so I haven't looked, you know, I haven't worked on Dharmayug very, you know, extensively, but in fact, if I think, well, I mean, and I focused on the story magazines, so they don't really talk about films. Although, as I say, I think some, you know, you can see that the films are somewhere there from they come in the artwork. So I think that some of the, you know, when you think of the art department, thinking about, okay, how do we accompany a story from Italy or from, I don't know, Latin America? I think they're coming with film visions. Interestingly, Kalpana, which is a highbrow magazine, more highbrow, but also, you know, really interesting magazine of the time. It has a radio, a column on radio. So Raghuveer Sahai, sort of, and I think that's been republished recently as well. So to be honest, I think the answer is these particular magazines, no. Caravan, yes. Illustrated Weekly of India, yes. Dharmayug, I'm sure, probably, but I haven't focused on. And other, Sarita, definitely. So I think probably the more what we would call more the kind of middlebrow magazines, more middlebrow digest magazines, they talk more about films. But yes, I think, you know, Thick and Thin is for me, you know, of course, comes from Goethe's anthropology, thin and thick description. But for me, it's useful for two reasons, if I may say here. One is because it helps us, give us a handle about the difference between the kind of, the snippet, the gleaning, this kind of incidental information that you get. All this very thin, okay, lots of names, but, nothing, what do you know about them? So differentiate between that and instead a more robust engagement, you could say. But at the same time, also not to devalue and dismiss completely thin. So thin can be a term then of disparagement. It's not thick. But I think thin does something anyway. It does produce this visibility and some kind of familiarity. So I think for me, that's why I like using those terms.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thanks, Priyanka. The next question is by Devmalya Biswas and then Shivani. Hi. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, Professor Francesca, for that wonderful talk. I was just thinking of an analogy between world literatures and world Englishes that was given by Braj Kachru. So I was thinking like the hierarchy that we have of countries in terms of their use of English in the world English is modeled by Braj Kachru. Do you think there is an implicit hierarchy when we talk about world literatures? Like, as you mentioned the term, the third world, the adjective third is particularly interesting because as I see in the world Englishes model too, there are three distinct layers: inner, outer, and expanding. The expanding one being that of countries that are now taking up English and prioritizing English education. And again, when I look at world literature too, if I consider the factors of visibility and familiarity, do you think there can be this sort of tripartite layers in terms of how literatures from countries that were not visible or familiar before, they are now becoming more and more familiar and being focused in these special editions? And there was this particular slide on special issues where you showed a cover from Desh, the Puja, the Durga Puja edition of Desh. I just wanted to mention that in terms of this particular Desh magazine, there is also a special issue that they bring out that is concurrent with the Calcutta Book Fair that has been going on from 1976. So that special issue too focuses on the new publications, very brief descriptions or summaries of the books that are on offer from the various publication houses. So have you found any such book fair edition or any such edition that is special in an unusual way in terms of other journals or magazines? Yeah, I think I wanted to talk about those. And one thing that is beyond the context of the presentation, the thing that you started the presentation with, that in academia, people are, or academics are nudged to find world literature just in English, and there being the projection of creativity, literary creativity, and that too being just in English. So I just wanted to ask, or just wanted to know about your opinion on how to resist this as academics ourselves, and is this sort of a projection where literary creativity is being only considered in terms of English? Is this a problem in terms of the visibility of other literatures, which tend to be marginalized, and there are attempts to dehegemonize, or there are attempts to decolonize these marginal literatures that are going on? So I think those were my questions or observations. Thank you, Professor Francesca.
Thank you very much. Those are great questions. I hope I can answer them all briefly. So one, the global Englishes and world literatures. Well, actually, I think it's very interesting, but I think in a way, world literatures, as you yourself were saying later, I think in the world literature and global Anglophone, or the global Anglophone is another term that in literary studies is going around. In fact, the three it's like the third or the second and third have almost sort of taken over the first, so the idea that in fact, and I think that there was up to maybe most visibly in the 90s, in the 1990s, the idea that, it was easier, you got more attention if you were a writer, writing in English from India, or, well, now it's Africa, than if you are say a writer from Glasgow. So that in fact again, the market, the attention of publishers, prizes, and so on is more geared, of readers, is more geared towards literatures from from this from these areas of the world that within the world global Englishes would be the third layer. Though of course in writing, as we know, in literary writing, most often it would not be necessarily the varieties of local English that are used, or and it's usually novels that get the attention and the prizes. They would be carefully calibrate between local varieties, typically more for dialogue or for particular characters, and instead a more standard English for other parts of the text. So it's rare. You have, Ken Saro-Wiwa, for example. You've got some Sosa Boy. You've got some texts that are throughout in the local variety, but this is pretty rare. Pretty rare. Certainly, also if we think of the English writing coming out of South Asia. So on the whole, I would say no. I would say it's different, and in fact, even I would say that in literary terms is almost like a combination in linguistic terms of of, let's say, standard English or global, and the first layer, you could say, and the third. And yes, for me, it's very much, so I'm jumping to the later question. Well, I hope that work like this is a way of resisting that particular identification of world literature with English in several ways. One is to say, for example, that as the focus on the magazine, that we can't just focus on books, for example, and then say that oh well, there are no translations in Hindi, or there are so few because there are so few translated books in Hindi. Oh, and so Hindi must be so peripheral and provincial because, well, actually, no, you just need to go to a different format, to a format that is more locally relevant. And instead you see that, a great deal of internationalism literary internationalism in Hindi in these particular decades. Another aspect in which I'm sort of, this research goes against the current definitions and models of world literature is the idea that, oh, well, so there is this either, global market, so it's either a function of the market or a function of the assimilation and of, regional literatures into this one single global world literature, is that, there is a standard value and a taste that will be the same for, and in Pascal Casanova's is the kind of, there's one literary meridian that marks the current taste. So if you're writing using a different style, a different form, a different mode, then you're both distant and usually, and of course that was the way in which the third world literature was also abandoned as a term in literary studies, was the idea that third world literature in Frederick Jameson's famous article always came behind. They were always late, they were catching up, that were Western literature, or the literary centers were, had already moved on, they were still writing like earlier, realist writing, for example. So for me, one important, and perhaps I should mention it more explicitly, is to show how much of interest and, in fact, energy in world literature has come with politics, so in fact, with politics, with political interest, interest in foreign literatures often comes together with, a political internationalism. And in fact, then, local rearticulation, local choices, local even ideas of what realism is and means are not necessarily what, realism was and meant for Balzac or for, Zola in France in the 19th century. We have to think about, okay, what is the rearticulation? What is the particular curation? What is being produced now, rather than some kind of, sort of single Eurochronology. Thank you. I mean, I'm afraid, I'm looking forward, in fact, for more work on, I'm very curious as to whether similar investment and similar use of magazines for world literature and particularly sort of the use of the special issue to make world literature visible takes place in other languages. And thank you very much for the Calcutta Book Fair reference. I think I can at least read the Bangla characters, so I can at least decipher the names and see who is published. So my point is that that's great that is happening. When you have the book, and maybe this is, in fact, this happens to a degree in some other European languages too. So I subscribe to an Italian book review, equivalent of the New York or London Review of Books, and they publish a lot of translations from other languages, particularly European ones. So, and in fact, much more, on several occasions you have had Nobel Prize winners who are not available in English but are available in Italian. So I think, outside English, I think with English you've got this sense that, oh well, if it's not available in English already, it probably doesn't deserve, my attention, or well, there's so much in English available already, so English already covers the world. Whereas I think in other languages, you can't imagine to be a world reader without reading in translation. It just doesn't happen. So yes, I would be very, very interested in knowing, for example, whether, again, if we think of, this very political decades of, decolonization, post-independence, post-war, whether, for example, and I'm particularly, as I say, interested in more mainstream magazines rather than the coterie, modernist ones. Other magazines invested in similar efforts, particularly because I think they didn't really have to pay for for the original. They didn't pay copyright, I'm sure. They could just source magazines, stories from existing, publications. They didn't care. So their costs would have been limited. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Professor Francesca. That was.
Hi, Shivani. Would you like to ask a question? Also have Anita Shirin here. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I thought that Shivani was going ahead of me anyway. So thank you so much, Professor Orsini, for this really enlightening talk. My question kind of comes to your talk from a slightly different angle, and that is of the state's linguistic policies regarding Hindi in the 1950s and 60s. And I work in the terrain of drama and dramatic literature, and there is a real sense in the theater and in dramatic writing in the 1950s and 60s, especially as the state is trying to locate the institutional hub of theater work in Delhi and at the National School of Drama, that Hindi lacks a corpus of dramatic writing. And so there is a real concerted effort to import
dramatic texts from other languages, say Kannada or Malayalam or Bangla or Punjabi or Gujarati or Marathi into Hindi. There is a very concerted effort to translate this work into Hindi so that Hindi could be enriched. There is also simultaneously a deep sense that the kind of dramatic work that is happening in the regions would acquire a visibility if they got to be translated into Hindi and then produced in Hindi. So there are a lot of theater magazines who are working on translations into Hindi. And all of it has this consciousness of Hindi trying to position itself as a national language. And definitely a sense of, so there is, so Hindi becomes a space where a very complicated politics of language, national and regional assertion comes to be articulated. So I was wondering if in the work that you are doing with Sarika and with Kamleshwar's editorial work, whether there is a sense of Hindi's positionality in such a way, or in the politics of language being articulated there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another great question. And in fact, I don't know what you think, but I've always thought, so there's a lot in magazines already in the 1940s, and then around independence. I think in public discourse in India, as you're saying, you're well aware of the idea that Hindi must somehow be, so it's not ready to be the national language. It must become the national language. It must become the national. So there must be this Indian literature. Hindi somehow must be the, got some articles that actually say Hindi. Yeah. Hindi must be the language of Indian literature by including words from all Indian languages. You can see how abstract thinking is. This idea that this is how it's going to happen, which of course doesn't really happen that way. And it seems to me that, and I think this comes back to the point about translations, and I don't know what your view is, but it seems to me that in fact the only field in which Hindi does come to play this national role is in fact drama, where also, because as you say, of the great, the importance of the National School of Drama, the sort of the translations, the great exchange between the theater festivals and so on. And it seems to me that perhaps if I think about it, compared to as I say, the very stilted, the very translations of stories in Sarika, but also in some of the other magazines, because drama, you have to speak it, has to work as a dramatic, as language. I think work on language is much more subtle there, and it's, the language is more colloquial, is richer, and so on. So in a way, Hindi as this sort of language for other regional languages works more. But I think also, and I think I go also with the with the idea that you can't really Hindi is as you say, it's a very contested and there's a lot of infighting, and there's a lot of different positions within Hindi at this time as well. So and in fact there's a sort of I noticed in some of the readers' letters to Sarika, there's somebody saying, thank God you've got this world literature, otherwise we're getting this bhartiyata, that's, it was going to lead us to some small tapu, and, we would have no relation to no. So I think in literary terms also, and this is a legacy from, 19th, early 20th century, and I think it continues, the idea that in a way Hindi, translations are, and as you can see, there's a big investment. I didn't focus it on Sarika, but Kahani for 5 years. Half of the magazine is translations from Indian languages. Sarika has special issues on the South, on other Indian languages. There's a lot all the time. So the idea really that Hindi literature is not Indian literature, and in fact that other, other literatures like Bangla, like Tamil, like Marathi are doing, really interesting work, and Punjabi, more and more interesting work possibly that we have to learn from. So I wouldn't say that necessarily this is a kind of struggle to position, Sarika and Hindi as the national literary language, but rather I would see it, from the tone of the editorials, from the tone of the, paratexts that accompany the translations, how the writers are presented and so on. This real, you could say, nation building, yes, but where, Hindi is, as much, in fact, is sort of finding its place among the other literatures. And again, what I would say is really interesting that, this is before, with Kahani particularly, before the Sahitya Academy. This is not a state. This is sort of literary activism. This is not a state enterprise. It's not a bureaucracy. There's not the bureaucracy of the Sahitya Academy. This is a, what I call magazine activism, literary activism, which of course drama is also very much happening in drama at the same time.
Thank you so much.
Francesca, can we take a couple of more questions, if that's all right? So Shivani, if you're back here.
Maybe Shivani, you can write your question and then I can answer.
Sarah?
Yeah, hi. So thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Lots of, very sort of interesting ideas for me to think about in terms of my own work. I mean, I'm just kind of curious about something that you kind of gestured to, but you didn't have time, I guess, to elaborate on. Is this, the something that you called a weak translation, right? So a lot of these stories are being translated in the magazine. And I'm kind of curious about, the I don't know whether to put it as the quality of translation or what are the processes of, these translations that are happening. And I ask this because in my own work, as you are familiar with, a lot of the Urdu film magazines from the 1930s and 40s, they're incorporating, not just, film theory, which is being borrowed from, Europe, but also, kind of translating the, stories, short stories, and incorporating that within the film magazine format. So I'm kind of curious to know what is happening in these journals, like Sarika, for example, in terms of translation. The film magazine, there is a very interesting way in which they translate, film material, for example, like Pudovkin and Eisenstein. And there's almost a kind of, if I can say that, almost like a lyricization or a kind of, poeticization of the material, where a lot of ideas of Pudovkin, I think, are made more or less, aestheticized, but also kind of infused with Urdu poetic traditions. And there's a kind of, freewheeling and a kind of liberty that's being taken with the translations in the film magazine. And I'm wondering if there is a similar kind of process at work in these special issues or in the literary journals as well. Thank you.
I wish. I think that sounds much more creative. I mean, I know that, so I didn't want to say quality of translation because then you fall into the kind of, is it correct? Does it correctly reproduce the original? Which I don't think is the problem here, to be honest. I think these are probably very correct translations. I mean, as far as I've been able to see. What I sense the problem is that, as you know, and actually, you don't see it in or you see it only very, very, you know, in a much more limited way in Hindi literary writing of the time. You know, we know that, you know, Hindi, like every language, is a language that is made of every register, you know, many registers and many, you know, many set of words and for example, you know, more, you know, could be more sort of tadbhav, as we say, you know, the kind of the more gharelu type of Rosmarra, could be more Urdu register within Hindi, could be more regional, you know, as we see with Renu and some of the other Anchalik writers and so on. Now, you see that all that in the creative writing in Hindi at the time. But I think what you see in translations, and I mention it because I think it's very much still an issue now. You know, I remember teaching a kind of a development booklet as an example in one of my advanced Hindi classes, to show that even something that is supposed to, you know, talk about the downtrodden and, you know, really speak about, you know, everyday problems, you know, they are trapped in this very, you know, standard Tatsam Shuddh Hindi register. And I see that, you know, which in a way, you know, if you read a Nirmal Verma story, or if you read a Kamleshwar story or Mohan Rakesh story, you know, this is a, you know, this does become part of literary Hindi, you know, particularly for this kind of, you know, middle class, urban, and particularly for, you know, the more abstract, you know, the sukshma and so on. But these writers still have access to and still use, you know, a wider range of vocabulary, of registers and so on. What instead seems to me is that, you know, the problem with these story translations is not, you know, again, usually the problem with translations of, or, you know, how do you translate public sphere in Hindi, or, you know, the key term, you know, the new term, but is really a poverty of, you know, a limited range of register, which of course in the case, you know, may be all right for an article. I mean, a lot of Hindi articles or translations of articles are like that. But for a story, for a literary piece, for a poem, it really kills it. You know, it's, where is the pleasure if there's no pleasure in language?
Thank you so much for that.
Hi, Pratibha. Do you
So I have the sense that your Urdu magazines, because they have this pleasure in language, you know, they actually do translations quite differently, which I think is a really, really interesting point to follow.
Yeah.
Hi, Pratibha. Do you have a question?
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, I'll mute myself.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak, and thank you to Professor Orsini for this splendid talk. Professor, my question actually is a little futuristic. And what I understood from your talk is that you emphasize the role of a little magazine, specifically Sarika, in actually positing a broad-based literary internationalism in the Hindi readership, and which was very different from the, you know, the position or what we understand of little magazine in the modernist context. And I also understood that point about positing the significant geographies which are crisscrossing and sort of an alternative conception to the general paradigm of world literature as a system. I was just interested in getting to know, have you given a thought about cyberspace, a space where these little magazines might be functioning in terms of circulation and translation and destabilizing these paradigms? Like, is there a new paradigm to consider cyberspace where little magazines now have readership? And considering that most of these magazines are in English, have you given a thought? Like, I would like to know if there is a Hindi magazine with wide circulation, global circulation in the cyberspace, perhaps positing a subversive paradigm to think beyond the world system theory, or even beyond the significant geography. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. If I may say so, I'm particularly interested not in little magazines because I think little magazines, have a different, often play kind of a slightly different role rather than this kind of broadening and kind of more, as you say, democratic, perhaps. No, so there often would be more difficult, perhaps also writers, or more difficult texts and so on, more avant-garde. This is more broad-based, as you say, broad-based literary magazine. I mean, as I showed at the beginning, I mean, I think at least within English, as I say, I think in other, I'm trying to look at some other language spaces like Italian and German to see whether there's more space for non-English and non-Western literatures to be visible, actually, and to be visible center stage, not just kind of marginal. In Italy, for example, you have, as I say, for some literatures like Arabic, Persian and so on, I think Japanese, I think you have actually more translations than English, but they're all tend to be in small publishers. Now there's an interesting magazine in Italian in the 90s that I want to work on, which actually does bring a lot of those, the books of those or text of those little publishers into the magazine, but it doesn't quite put them there center stage and try to think of them as kind of world literature in the way that Sarika does. But I still have to think about it more. So if I look at Asymptote or Words Without Borders, which is actually a continuation of Books Abroad, I think that in fact in English at the moment, that seems to be the only space apart from small publishers. And in fact, again, often they are in a symbiosis, of course, with academic work. And again, I think if you think of the US publishing, a lot of, apart from, you either have small publishers like New Directions or some other publishers like that, or New York River Books publishers, or then you have academic publishers that publish translations. So they would be, I think a lot of mainstream publishers just do not publish translations. They don't, or they only publish, I don't know, when they become Nobel Prize winners, type of thing. So the little magazine, the digital little magazine is often the only space. And one can hope, sort of optimistically say, oh, well, this is the kind of the investment for the future. First you appear there and then you become mainstream. But I don't think that necessarily happening, I think, if I think of myself, I never really translated from Hindi, apart from a long time ago into Italian or into English. I didn't decide to try to break that boundary. There are other boundaries, as we know, there's a lot of translations of Indian literature into English in India that does not circulate abroad, So my point is that actually there are a lot of translations there, but within David Damrosch's model of literature, world literature circulation, you would almost think like, okay, once the translation happens, that's it, that's a work done. But I actually see, that's why I put an emphasis on invisibilization. And I think there's actually quite a lot of, work that magazines now do, that theory now does, to make literatures in languages other than English invisible. And I'm not sure that I think the work that Asymptote and Words Without Borders, is fantastic, because also they don't just make it visible. They are good translations. They're very, there's a good literary sense. There's a sense that these are rich texts. They're not just, oh, well, if you want to know something about Vietnam, read this about Vietnam. There's a real literary tradition, sense, aesthetic, sensibility. They're worth reading. So I think in that sense, they score very high. But I don't see them really breaking through in the mainstream publishing. And I think we have to really fight against this vision that says, oh, well, if it's not, if it's not on Amazon, if it's not, in Booker Prize, if it's not in my local bookshop, it's not worth reading, or it's not, it's not worth world literature. That's what decides what world literature is.
I think we'll take one final question. Shivani has finally typed it out for us. Were there any tensions between the internationalist ambitions and the Shuddh Hindi of many of the publications you mentioned? And if so, could you speak to these possible tension between the internationalist scope and the specific Hindi register, which you pointed out, could be found in many of these magazines? Thank you.
I think I partly answered that already. I mean, the only point perhaps I would ask here is that usually when we talk of Shuddh Hindi, then we think of a kind of Hindutva or Hindu Hindi, Hindustan. I don't think that I think in the case of translations is more than as now, is more, in fact, probably a result of education, the kind of Shuddh Hindi that you learn as part of your education. So that is not a kind of conscious, translations must be in Shuddh Hindi because, because this is the proper type of Hindi and this is the proper national languages and so on. I think it's a more, and in a way, more difficult to combat, it's because it's part of a whole system of reproduction, of linguistic reproduction. If I may add one more thing, I mean, I found it really, really interesting. Kanopriya mentioned the English work, project, and the English book is out, and the really interesting article by Santosh Desai, chapter by Santosh Desai in it. He says that, within advertising, the role of the bhasha kind of person within an advertising agency changed, overnight and completely from earlier on where the creative work of the ad was done in English, and then the bhasha writers would just translate. So they were seen as kind of second order. With the rise of English as, instead, the key to advertising in the 1990s for all sorts of reasons that we don't need to go into now, the bhasha writers becomes key and crucial. But crucially, again, it's not the ability to write Shuddh Hindi, obviously. It's the ability to, to have all the different registers and puns and fun and this and that with language at their fingertips, So, so I think that is a really good, counterexample. We should think of the translator as somebody who does have that particular rich relationship with language and with registers, and cannot just think of the correct, but of the rich, of the good, of the exciting translation.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And I'm sure there are still more questions, but we've already taken up a lot of your time. And I mean, this lecture was especially important for, this school and, the kind of courses that we're trying to develop, as somebody also highlighted in the questions, that we should think about incorporating these significant geographies into, our thought, our course curriculums and so on. And I think now I'll start to think of ways in which we can do that here in JSLL as well. So very important talk per usual, and always, looking forward to your conversations and the lectures and sessions, and hoping to see you soon again in India or abroad. Thank you so much, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Our next talk will be on March 14th by Professor Anjali Narlikar, and I hope to see some of you there as well, and hopefully you too, Francesca. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and all the best for your school.
Right. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.